Welcome to the Zombie Story Zone, where the undead rise and terror lives. Tonight, we bring you an eerie tale that will haunt your dreams. Zombie farmers, the dead rise on a remote farm. In this chilling story, a quiet farm transforms into a nightmare as the family must face their loved ones brought back from the grave. Before we dive into the horror, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more spine-tingling stories, and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear what scares you the most about the undead. Now, sit back, turn off the lights, and let's dive into the terror.
Music.
The dry, barren field lay silent under the pale glow of the moon, a thin layer of mist creeping across the soil like fingers of some spectral hand. The Parker family farmhouse stood in the distance, its weathered wood and cracked windows hinting at years of stories, both good and bad, held within its walls. Tonight, however, was different. Tonight, something stirred beneath the earth. Jessie Parker tugged at the latch of the chicken coop, glancing around the fields with a sense of unease. At 17, she was used to farm life, accustomed to the occasional strange sounds in the night and the eerie silence of the land. But this was different. There was something deeply wrong in the air. Her father, Tom, had been out late mending the fences along the edge of the property. He was a gruff man, worn by the land and his years of labor, but he was good-hearted. Jessie's mother, Sarah, watched from the porch, worry lines etched into her face as she waited for her husband to return. "Jessie," Sarah called, her voice carrying through the quiet night. "Did you lock the coop?" "Yes, ma'am," Jessie shouted back, feeling a chill creep up her spine as she hurried back toward the house. Shadows seemed to shift in the fields, their edges blurred and indistinct. She couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on her, watching, waiting. The sound of rustling leaves drew her gaze to the right, where the old oak tree stood near the edge of the field. Jessie squinted, searching for any movement, but there was nothing, just the stillness of the night and the quiet pulse of dread in her veins. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. Jessie recognized her father's tall, broad form and felt a rush of relief. He was stumbling, though, his steps uneven. As he drew closer, she noticed his clothes were torn and muddy, and his face was pale, his eyes vacant. "Dad?" Jessie's voice was small, hesitant. Tom stopped, his head tilting toward her, his lips parting in a grotesque smile that revealed blood-stained teeth. Jessie took a step back, heart pounding. As he reached out, fingers curled into claws. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling. But the thing wearing her father's face wasn't listening. It lunged, and Jessie screamed. Sarah raced down the porch steps, her heart hammering as she grabbed Jessie by the arm, pulling her back just as Tom's gnarled fingers closed around the air where her daughter had stood. The two of them stumbled backward, staring in horror at the man they'd known all their lives, now a monstrous shell. Tom's skin was in a natural shade of gray, his eyes cloudy and unfocused. He snarled, a guttural sound that sent chills down their spines. "Get inside," Sarah yelled, shoving Jessie toward the house. They sprinted up the steps, slamming the door shut just as Tom threw himself against it, scratching and pounding with a relentless fury. "Mom, what's happening?" Jessie's voice quivered as she locked the door, hands shaking. Sarah didn't answer right away, too busy dragging a heavy wooden dresser in front of the door. She took a deep breath, turning to face her daughter, and shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know, honey, but that's not your father. Not anymore." They backed away from the door, Jessie's eyes flickering to the small window beside it. Outside, more shadows moved among the fields, shambling figures emerging from the ground like grotesque crops springing to life. "I think it's the graves," Sarah whispered, the realization sinking in. "The old family cemetery on the other side of the hill. They're coming back." As the night wore on, more of the undead gathered around the house, pounding on windows and doors with a maddening persistence. Sarah and Jessie huddled in the living room, barricading the windows with whatever they could find. Occasionally, they'd catch a glimpse of the dead faces they recognized, twisted and decayed. Uncle Joe, who had passed away 2 years ago, now staggered through the garden, his once kind eyes clouded and lifeless. Aunt May shuffled past, her mouth hanging open in a silent scream, bits of earth still clinging to her skin. "What are we going to do, Mom?" Jessie asked, her voice trembling. "They're everywhere. We have to hold out until morning," Sarah replied, gripping her daughter's hand. "Maybe the light will drive them back. Until then, we just have to stay alive." A loud crash sounded from the back of the house. Sarah and Jessie bolted upright, adrenaline surging. One of the kitchen windows had shattered, and they could hear the dead shuffling inside, their moans filling the air. "We have to get to the attic," Sarah whispered urgently, grabbing Jessie's hand. They sprinted down the hall, the sound of footsteps and groaning echoing behind them as they climbed the narrow stairs. The attic was dark and cramped, filled with old boxes and dusty furniture. Sarah and Jessie pulled the trapdoor shut, barricading it with a heavy chest. They sat in silence, catching their breath, listening to the relentless sounds of the undead below. The house creaked and groaned as the dead shuffled through it, their voices an endless chorus of hunger and despair. Hours passed, each one feeling like an eternity. Jessie's eyes grew heavy, but she forced herself to stay awake, her body tensed with fear. She and her mother clung to each other, their hearts beating as one as they waited for dawn. At last, a sliver of light crept through the attic window. The undead in the house seemed to slow, their movements growing sluggish. Sarah and Jessie exchanged a glance, a flicker of hope igniting in their eyes. "We need to make a run for it," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If they're weaker in the daylight, we might have a chance to escape." They unblocked the trapdoor and crept down the stairs, moving cautiously through the house. The undead were scattered, milling about aimlessly, their once frantic movements now lethargic. They slipped out the back door, hearts pounding as they hurried toward the barn, hoping to grab the old truck and drive far away from the cursed land. "We're safe now, right?" Jessie asked, her voice shaky. Sarah didn't answer, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. She knew there were no guarantees, not anymore. But for now, they had escaped the nightmare. They were alive. Hours later, as they approached the edge of town, they saw a group of survivors gathered near the outskirts. Relief washed over them until they noticed the grim expressions on the townsfolk's faces. Jessie and Sarah got out, and an older man approached, his face pale. "It's spreading," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's not just your farm. They're rising everywhere." Sarah's heart sank. She glanced at Jessie, gripping her daughter's hand as they turned to look back at the road they'd traveled, where the faint figures of the undead still loomed in the distance. They weren't safe, none of them were. But as Jessie looked up at her mother, determination hardening in her eyes, she knew they wouldn't go down without a fight. Together, they would stand against the rising tide of the undead, because even in the face of death, they were survivors. Weeks later, the Parker farm lay silent once more. The fields were empty, the undead having moved on in search of new prey. But beneath the soil, deep in the darkness, something still stirred. And one night, under a pale and ghostly moon, the earth cracked open, and the dead began to rise once more.